Okay, thank you, and congratulations for having such a wonderful event. This is actually the second time that I've been lucky enough to present here. The first time was a big group presentation in which AstraZeneca presented some of the cutting-edge technologies they were working on. Today, it's more a presentation about a simple solution that can have a big impact if done on time and in the right way. But because we're about to talk about issues related to the pandemic, I just want to say there are so many more who've done so much more for the pandemic than what you're going to see here. We've had people whose personal lives have been affected, medical workers who've been on the front line. Related to this vaccine, there's been Oxford University who did a lot of the science behind the scenes, and also my colleagues who stood up a whole new arm of the business to distribute the vaccine. Additionally, in this presentation, you're going to see some NLP performed by a third-party tool called Termite, distributed by a company called SciBite that we've used. And then finally, all my colleagues who were involved in this project. So context always matters. And the context we found ourselves in this project was 2020. Against a backdrop of increasing border closures, as you can see here from this chart, which shows the partial and complete border closures in the world, alongside the COVID-19 cases. In October 2020, that was when this project was needed, and you can see we're against a backdrop of border closures and increasing cases, and no real certainty about when a return to normal would be. From a Swedish perspective, we had been through the big first wave of very serious cases, as you can see here. In October, things had died down a bit, but cases were increasing again. And that was when the vaccine trials had reached a critical stage and they needed a solution. So in order to fully understand this story, you're going to have to know something about vaccine development. It begins with some basic laboratory work in the exploratory phase, and then once we have a vaccine candidate, it moves on to a preclinical phase where some basic testing is done, but nothing on humans at this stage. When we talk about clinical trials, we're talking about testing a vaccine candidate in humans. It begins with phase 1 clinical trials, which are normally a limited group of people. They and their doctors may know that they are taking the candidate vaccine, and if these prove efficacious and safe, the vaccine trials move on to what's called phase 2, which is an expanded group of people, and these are normally blinded, which means that both the doctors and the patients are unaware that they're taking the candidate vaccine. And finally, we move into phase 3 clinical trials, where you may have tens to hundreds of thousands of patients, all being closely monitored by doctors who, as I mentioned, are unaware if the patient is taking the candidate vaccine. So they have to record very carefully any medical symptoms observed in the patients in order to report them to regulatory authorities. And these regulatory authorities may, and in this case did, ask for weekly updates regarding symptoms displayed by patients. So the outcome of a doctor's assessment of a patient is what's referred to as a plain text narrative. And basically it's just a description they write of the symptoms a patient may have. Now you need to remember that we have several 100,000 patients, and these patients may be going to a doctor several times under the course of a trial. So we in fact have a huge volume of these plain text narratives from which we need to extract some sort of statistical information to present to regulatory authorities. Thankfully, the pharmaceutical industry has a long-standing standard related to this, known as the Medical Dictionary of Regulatory Activities, or MedDRA for short. Basically, it involves taking a very specific description of a symptom as the lowest level term, and then this gets coded through to an increasingly abstract set of terms So you can see an example of that here, where we start with a very specific term, conjunctival abrasion, superficial injury of conjunctiva. That gets abstracted to conjunctival abrasion and on through to eye disorders. All information regarding the vaccine is conveyed to the regulators in this statistically summarised form according to MedDRA. Now, here we see our example narrative that's been processed, and you can see that the medical terms have been extracted, and in some cases they change. Fell becomes fall, broke their leg becomes broken leg, and so on. But it may surprise you to find that this process is manual, or was manual, in 2020. And so this responsibility often falls to a single individual, and you can imagine the stress and pressure that such an individual is under during the course of a very high-profile clinical trial to get this right and do it in a timely fashion, week after week, as these narratives roll in. So there's a big opportunity to help here, and we as an enterprise address this by assembling a cross-functional team comprising all the areas shown here, through from quality and compliance, through all the different engineering disciplines, and also obviously including those people who do the review themselves. So this all had to happen very fast, right? So the majority of this work was delivered into this project within a week. Basically, we had the kickoff meeting on Monday. By Tuesday, we had the data, a use case definition, our infrastructure requirements. Wednesday, we were deploying and qualifying the infrastructure. In the background, the NLP models were being developed on dummy data, and we were reviewing the solution from an ethical point of view. And by Friday, we'd signed off all aspects related to risk, privacy, validation, and obviously security. So let's look at all these areas in a little bit more detail. First, quality, and quality really does come first in a project like this. All our work is governed by good practice guidelines, known as GXP, where the X substitutes for various things such as clinical or manufacturing. And you can think of this as a way in which any component of a drug delivery program is known to operate as it should. So we do this by having all work logged, a detailed requirement specification that is tested and validated against. Now, this was one of the first projects that we've done using AI and ML. So we had to develop a set of guidelines for the responsible use and application of ML and apply those to this project as a forerunner in the area. Data is obviously a huge consideration here. The primary data was owned by Oxford University. We needed to arrange a secure data transfer from them to us. This is all potentially personally identifiable data, which could be used to actually identify a patient. And so we need to establish a secure chain of custody, and the regulators will often ask you, who did what to the data, when, and for what reason, and you need to be in a position to answer that within 24 hours usually. So obviously we need security controls at all stages so that no one who shouldn't be accessing the data is able to access the data. And finally, consent is a big issue because the usage of the data is changed to include machine learning and AI, so we need to update the consent the patients have given to include that use case. So with our quality and data considerations in hand, we were able to propose a solution, and we weren't able to propose a completely automated solution because our ethical and compliance responsibilities means that a human must always validate the medical narratives and see that this is done correctly. But we were able to use NLP to pre-process the data and display to the human classifiers the extracted terms, and their job simply becomes to either correct it or accept it. So this is a mock-up that we actually presented in the early stages of the project, and you can see it's very, very simple. you have a column that presents the unprocessed narrative, and then next to that, the extracted standardized term. Now, this is very simple, but one colleague reflected to me, if it was any more complex, it would probably be useless because of the time pressures involved. And simple as it is, it was able to bring to tears one of the members of the coding team who had been struggling with all these manual coding events to do. So that was nice to be able to help out a colleague with an automated tool. So let's talk a bit more about the NLP that we used to do this. We used a third-party tool, as I mentioned earlier, called Termite for the medical term extraction. Basically, it uses fuzzy matching of the edit distance of a string and also some contextual cues in order to determine if a term identified in the narrative matches a predefined set of terms in a library, or a vocab as they're called in Termite. We compare the observed versus the expected terms, and from that we determine three things, which is the match rate, so how many terms were actually matching exactly as a human coder would do it, the no match rate, as in things we completely missed, and the mismatch rate, where we get either an incorrect number of medical terms extracted from the narrative, or we found matches that weren't actually correct. So we got some data to validate the solution. They provided approximately 17,000 manually coded narratives, each of them having one or more medical terms. A total of approximately 22,000 medical terms was available, and most of these only had a single medical term to extract. If we look at the accuracy we obtained using the base Termite solution, it was approximately 50% match rate, correctly identified. In brackets there, you can see what that relates to in terms of medical terms. The no match rate is shown, and the mismatch rate as well. We were able to somewhat reduce the no match rate by adding a list of synonyms to the solution, and then using some rule-based correction, we were able to reduce some of the mismatch rate and improve the match rate to a final value of 63%, approximately. Now, there are obviously factors that are going to affect the solution accuracy. This is the threshold that you set for your fuzzy matching. Many ways, this is just a calculated guess, and you just have to do your best. Partial matches are also problematic, where we only get a selection of the medical term. So here we've used the example of infection versus upper respiratory tract infection. But you can imagine this becomes much more problematic when negatives are involved. So detecting infection from no infection is obviously quite a problem. Also, the ground truth data itself can be incorrect. The coding team is not 100% accurate, so any problems with the ground truth data is going to negatively affect the assessment of the tool. Humans are very creative with their spelling errors. We can get a lot of them by adding a synonyms list, but it's impossible to catch every error a human will make. And finally, some of the coding may be given by the primary owners of the data, and that comes from signals that we don't have access to. Also, a final point is that a human, when given a list of symptoms and a resulting diagnosis, will only take the diagnosis and ignore the symptoms, whereas the tool will try and extract every bit of information. So in order to further verify this data that we'd obtained, we asked the coding team to manually look at some of our mismatched terms. And we gave them a small percentage to look at. They found that actually many of these terms, approximately 30 to 40%, were actually hits, compared to 60% misses, and many of the misses came from a single adverse event, which we were able to mitigate to some extent by adding synonyms for it. And as I mentioned, there were 5 terms that were noted to have a custom diagnosis sent from Oxford that did not match the corresponding narrative. So the solution accuracy is therefore somewhere in the range of 63% if we throw away all mismatched terms, to 86% if we include them all. But assuming that this sample is representative of the rest of the data, it's likely to be around 72% accurate. What that means in practice is that 3/4 of the work of these human coders can actually now be done in an automated fashion, and that is a significant reduction in workload. Now, when I said that we did all this work in a week, that wasn't quite true. We actually had an ongoing program to deliver a machine learning and AI platform to our entire R&D community. And I know as ML and AI engineers, we're probably all a bit sick of showing each other the Gartner diagram where the model is just a tiny little box in a sea of other boxes that's referred to unkindly as technical debt, I think. But I think of this stuff as where a model needs to sit in order to actually have any impact. So basically, our setup was a 3 AWS account setup where we have one account for the shared services, one account which we call the environment account, where we host our development and testing activities, and one production account where our production workload runs, and we can be sure that it's not going to be interfered with by any development work. And this is offered to our ML, AI engineers and data scientists on a per project basis. So there's no problems with people from other projects in here. As I mentioned before, security and compliance comes first. So all our security access controls are built into this system using the principle of least access. So nobody who shouldn't be able to access the data can access the data. And through the use of CloudTrail and Athena, we're able to give regulators a complete picture of all the data level events that are taking place in our environment. In terms of the networking, this is also done securely. So we use only private subnets in the development and production accounts and route the traffic through to the internet via a transit gateway, which in turn connects via a corporate security cloud connector, which is able to do things like whitelisting, blacklisting, content filtering. As I mentioned, storage lies within the shared services account, and this is all segregated by environment. So nobody in the development account can access production data and vice versa. And also we provide a set of secure baseline configurations of AWS tools to our machine learning engineers in the AWS service catalog. So they're able just to select from the service catalog what products they would like to launch without having to think about security, compliance, all those things, and just get on with their work. And we offer a complete range of SageMaker services, databases, compute in the form of Lambda, CI/CD tools, and also some analysis tools. So in the context of this project, what the machine learning engineers were able to do on Thursday, as I showed you before, is log into this environment, go to the service catalog, and launch a Jupyter Notebook in order to do their first assessment of the data. They're then also able to launch a code build job to securely build the containers needed for a containerized workflow to perform this analysis. They're able to deploy that into a development environment and assess it initially, and then promote it up through the various stages of testing and production. Oh, there's a typo in my thing. And able to finally have a production running service in the production account. So if we look at this from an end-to-end process, we can see that we had the data coming in from Oxford into our GXP validated data store. That's when the data science and AI scope begins. We're able to securely sync this through to the environment that you've seen, where we use containerized workflow using the Termite third-party tool in order to perform the analysis, generate the output, which is then synced through to a location where the medical coding team can access it, perform their QA, do the MedDRA coding, and then finally report this on through to Oxford, who reports this on to regulators. So if we talk about the impact of this assessment, of this solution, we can see that we have, in the first 2 months, over 6,000 adverse events extracted. We managed to get a better hit rate versus fully manual coding from this hybrid process of NLP-assisted and human verification. Narrative processing time dropped by half, and yep, we saved a little bit of money. But I think the real impact of this is measured by the fact that we were able to free up people's time so that they could work on the really challenging parts of their job, which is the difficult narratives to code, and we could take a lot of stress and pressure off them. And what this means is that ultimately you end up with better outcomes for patients. So finally, I would just like to touch on scale, because scale matters. And what I've shown to you today is just one example of a very high-profile machine learning product that's running in our enterprise data science and machine learning platform. But as of today, well, when I made this slide, we currently had many of these AI and ML projects running. So right now we have about 300 AWS accounts, all of which are running machine learning and AI projects using this toolbox approach, where people can just take the AWS services they need to deploy models and get them through to production safely. And I think the outcome of that is really a more data-driven culture at AstraZeneca, which leads to better outcomes for patients. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you. So, since you finished a little bit for the 25 minutes, I'll just squeeze in a few questions.
Okay, here we go.
So, it sounded to me that the data set was actually available at the time, right? A labeled data set with the narratives and the MedDRA classifications. Was that the case?
Yeah, so there was a labeled data set, and the data, because obviously this was an ongoing project, right? So the medical coding team was getting these narratives, coding them, giving them on to the regulators. But so by the time we were engaged in this project, they were saying, you know, this is way too much work. We need some help. Here's what we've done already, and make something happen.
Cool. And can you make any sort of estimate if this solution changed the arrival time of the clinical trials? Like, were you able to finish them faster than you would have otherwise?
Well, yeah, probably, because we increased the coding time by 50%. So I can't give you a daily estimate or a weekly estimate what that related to, but I think in many ways, as I mentioned, the big benefit was the increase in quality that it allowed, rather than you know, time or money savings.
Right. But in the end, that means that you actually saved some lives, I guess, because...
Yeah, I mean, the AstraZeneca vaccine is now over 2 billion doses, so I think we've released in the media what that means in terms of lives saved, and this was a very small part of that effort. It was a huge effort across the company, but we did something towards that.
I mean, it's not every day you can say that an NLP model saved lives.
No, that is true. That is true.
You should have had that in the slides. Okay. I dare to squeeze in one question.
Okay.
Yeah. We have one over in the back. So you have a mic.
Thank you. Looking back from the process that you did, do you think it would be better to work on NLP tools as a processing unit in the middle, or we should focus on data entry point and NLP tools as assisting tool for entry semantically relevant data instead of plain text?
I'm not sure how to answer that. Looking back on it, I think we did the best we could. Obviously, we're looking to further generations of this product where we take that third-party tool, the NLP component, and develop it further. Using some different models, and so the end-to-end process that we've assembled is quite modular, and we can now begin to tweak it. But at the time of delivery, it was very much do what's expedient and then make it better later on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
That's enough.
Thanks, guys.